Scholars, we will be continuing with lesson 4, and I'd like everyone to go to page 239. We're going to start on page 239, getting started. Okay, so with these 3 problems, we are going to use the commutative and the associative property. Commutative for the first 2 and the associative for the third one. And I will post a couple of videos on the stream page to help with that if you can't remember what those properties are. Alright, so first, using the commutative property, we can look at negative 8 plus 5 plus 8. Well, using the commutative property, we know that negative 8 plus 8 cancel each other out to equal 0, so we are left with 5 as our answer. For B, it's a blurry yellow. Okay, there we go. We know that using the commutative property, we know that negative 1/2 and negative 1/2, when we combine them together, we get negative 1. Negative 1 is the same as negative 5 over 5, so negative 5 over 5 plus 3 over 5 gives us a negative 2/5. And then last one, using the associative property, we have, there we go, okay. So using the associative property, we can say that 3/8 and 5/8, combining those together gives us 1 whole. And then when we subtract 5/6, well, we just first find a common denominator. So 3/8 and 5/8 combine equal 1 whole. So that is the same as saying 6 over 6. So 6 over 6 minus 5 over 6 would be 1/6. Alright, so now we are on page 240. And as you can see, we are going to be distributing and factoring with negative 1. Now, we've already gone over that the opposite of 4 is negative 4. The opposite of any positive number will give us a negative. The opposite of any negative number will give us a positive. Now, when we look at this example right here, the expression says negative 7 plus 2. Now, when we factor out a negative 1, that's the same thing as saying 7 minus 2. Okay, now let's look at this. If we have negative 7 plus 2, negative 7 plus 2, if we factor out a negative 1 out of 7, we have a positive 7. And when we factor out a negative 1 out of a positive 2, we have a negative 2. Okay? So negative 7 plus 2 is the opposite of 7 minus 2. Let's look back up here. So negative 7 plus 2 gives us a negative 5. Well, this right here, we have 7 minus 2. The opposite of 7 minus 2, well, 7 minus 2 is 5, and the opposite of 5 is negative 5. So these are the exact same thing. So when we say the opposite of 7 minus 2, the opposite, we just have a negative right here, okay? So negative 7 plus 2 is the same as saying the opposite of 7 minus 2. All we did was we factored out a negative 1 from this expression, okay? Now, when we look at this right here, if we can have a negative in front of the parentheses, or we can have a negative 1 in front of the parentheses. They're the exact same thing. Okay? Alright, so let's look at this problem right here. We have, there we go. Alright, so we have negative 1 minus 6. The problem asks us to draw a model like what we did up here. So I want you guys to do that for each of these problems and then rewrite each as an opposite of a different expression, okay? So basically you're doing the exact same thing that you did up here for these problems. If you have any questions about that or are a little confused about what to do, please let me know. I can definitely help you. But just as a little heads up, so if you factor out a negative 1 from negative 1, you have a positive 1. And if you factor out a negative 1 from a negative 6, you have a positive 6. So this would be the exact same thing. Sorry, my handwriting's a little bad. Okay, I'm writing sideways. Okay, so negative 1 minus 6 is the same as factoring out a negative here, and in the parentheses we'd have a 1 plus 6, okay? So that's the exact same thing. So now we are on page 241. Now I'd just like to let you know and remind you about the difference between factoring and the distributive property. So if we were to have, for instance, negative 2 minus 3, we could factor out a negative 1 out of both of these. So we could have a negative. We factored out a negative 1, so factoring out a negative 1 will give us a positive 2. And then factoring out a negative 1 from a 3 gives us a positive 3. So when we factor out, we have 2 plus 3 inside of the parentheses. Now when we use the distributive property, we would take this negative and multiply it times 2 to give us a negative 2. And using the distributive property again, negative times 3 gives us a negative 3. So when we do this, we're multiplying. This is the distributive property, and this is our answer, okay? Now let's look at number 4, right here. All right, so we're going to rewrite each expression as an addition or subtraction expression using a factor of negative 1. Now, I want to, well, if we factor out a negative 1 out of negative 2, we get a positive 2. So we get a 2 here. And when we factor out a negative 1 out of negative 4, we have a positive 4. So what's going to go in our parentheses is 2 plus 4. Okay? So I want you to do B. And then I just want to give you a little reminder. When we have a negative and a negative, that's the same thing as saying the opposite of negative 9. So when we have two negatives together, or subtraction and a negative, we're just going to put two positives. That's the same exact thing. So when we have this, we would have negative 9 plus 9. So when we factor out a negative, well, taking a negative, we factor out a negative here, we have a positive 9. And when we factor out a negative 1 out of a positive 9, we get a negative 9. So that's what goes inside of the parentheses, okay? All right, so if you guys have any questions about this lesson, please let me know. I'm always here to help.